Thank you very much. I always try and preempt introductions because they get more and more embarrassing, and then I fail to live up to. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a topic that's very dear to my heart. And I haven't got very long. Which reminds me, I better take my watch off so that I can ignore it. Just before I get into my talk, I want to do two advertisements for related work that I've been doing. So one is I've been co-directing a commission on state fragility and development, which was jointly chaired by David Cameron and Donald Kaberuka. Donald Kaberuka, for 10 years, the president of the African Development Bank and Rwanda's Minister of Finance. That is I'm very proud of that commission report, which you can freely download. It's called Escaping the Fragility Trap. And it's a very important set of messages for how public policy needs to change in order to make a dramatically better job of helping the most fragile countries on Earth catch up. So that's escaping the fragility trap, freely downloadable, no excuses if that's what you're interested in. The second is an even more exciting moment for me because I've written what I hope will be the book of my life, and last night I got the first advanced copy of it. So you might not be excited by this, but I am. So this is it. It's called The Future of Capitalism. It's not actually available on the market yet. I guess it'll be available in about a month, but anyway, I cannot resist plugging it. And now I better say something. And the message is that you're all familiar with your heartstrings being pulled by NGOs depicting Africa's children, right? And it's the searing, iconic image of global poverty as an African child, right? And my message is, those children, 10 years later, are looking for a job, right? They're youths desperately worried about how they're going to earn a living, right? And the central task of development is an economic task of providing productive jobs for those millions of young people. And the key word there is not jobs, it's productive. Right? There was a figure showing unemployment in Africa. Unemployment's a pretty meaningless concept. If you're poor, you can't afford to be unemployed. But the truth is that across Africa, young people are just pushed into jobs of desperation, grindingly low productivity, and so doomed to poverty. Right? And so the challenge of development is not jobs, it's productive jobs. And there's only one way to do productive jobs. Economists have known this for 250 years. It's called firms, right? Businesses. What do? They perform a daily miracle of productivity, and it's not complex. It's not fancy. The miracle of productivity is achieved by bringing workers together and organizing them so that you can reap economies of scale and economies of specialization. That's what every modern firm does virtually in its sleep, whatever its particular activity It's scale and specialization. And that combination transforms ordinary people's productivity. Adam Smith noticed this of the peasants who came into the factories. Right? Where I was born was just 10 miles away from the first factory on Earth. Right? And it was transformative. Right? It wasn't caused by education. The same people who'd been working solo on a loom in a cottage were suddenly transformed by water power and scale of a factory, and then specialization. Some people could do one thing, others do another. The typical worker in Africa works solo. 2/3 of Africa's human capital is employed solo, doomed to poverty, no scale, no productivity. Africa needs firms, proper firms, not micro-enterprises or the cuddly little things that some NGOs seem to love, right? Firms, proper modern firms, right? Now, growing firms is something that is happening in Africa, right? Africa's getting its own firms, but growing them yourself is a very slow process. It took Europe the best part of 150 years before it started to get enough modern firms, right? Proper firms. And we can't wait 150 years in Africa. Foreign firms can speed things up. And the main reason they speed things up is they get copied. Let me give you the example of Bangladesh, which now has an enormous garments industry, basically focused on exports. It exports $30 billion a year of garments. It's a huge industry. It's transformed employment opportunities, especially for the group in society that most needed it, young women. Because young women in Bangladesh now are able to earn their own living, that's improved their bargaining power within the household. And so it's dramatically improved gender relations. How did the Bangladesh garments industry get started? Because a foreign firm came and set up business there. And the local workers who worked for the firm decided they could do that, and they copied it. So, Africa needs firms. But firms don't need Africa. There's a problem called first mover disadvantage. Pioneers, the firms that pioneer a sector, if the sector succeeds, they get copied. If it fails, they lose their money because there's no one to sell the assets to. And so nobody wants to be a pioneer. Right? That's first mover disadvantage. Right? The foreign firm that went to Bangladesh, lost money, gave up and left. Right? Bangladesh only got its garment industry by a mistaken investment decision of a firm. Right? That's why we need public money to lower the cost of entry of the pioneers. In the modern world, it's very improper for an economist to use the word subsidy. We're all supposed to be private, private, private. Pioneer firms need a phase of subsidy. It must not be permanent, because if it's permanent, it's unsustainable. And so the skill of an organization like Norfund is in taking the risks involved in judging that this firm will need some money to get started. If it could do it without Norfund, what are you there for? Don't waste your money. But it needs Norfund to get started, but then will be sustainable. inevitably, Norfund will make some mistakes doing that. It should be making mistakes. It should. One of the most embarrassing moments in the Commission on State Fragility was the Vice President for MEGA, the insurance arm of the World Bank, which of course recruits its staff from the private insurance industry. And the private insurance industry mantra is, don't take any risk. And so my colleague, Tim Besley, posed the question to the Vice President, how much actually do you have to pay out in your insurance in fragile states? And the Vice President proudly said, nothing. They're not taking any risk. And so he pointed out, you're not doing your basic job. What do you exist for if it's not to provide political risk cover, bear risk in fragile states? So Africa needs firms, it needs our firms, but what it's got is our NGOs. I'm very proud that there's a trade minister from Uganda here. 20 years ago, when I was working in Uganda, I checked on registered firms and registered NGOs. 20 years ago, Uganda had more registered NGOs than registered firms. Not registered foreign firms, registered firms, right? That was a desperate imbalance. Some NGOs have been very useful. I've worked very hard with NGOs to get the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative become a global norm, and I'm very proud, Norwegians can be very proud, that it's here based in Norway, even though you've got a Swede as its head. But a lot of NGOs have become ideological and frankly ignorant. I was last in Kampala in February working with Jennifer Masisi, the feisty and capable woman who's head of the Kampala Capital City Authority, as she says, trying to transform Kampala from 50 years of neglect, which has produced chronic congestion. So as part of that, she's trying to widen roads. You know, a modern city like Oslo, the center of the city is about 30% of it is road. Right? Kampala, it's way less than that. They've got to widen the roads. To widen the roads, the state has got to acquire land. Right? And the NGOs have lobbied the World Bank because they've somehow managed to muddle up the important concept of human rights with the concept of the rights of individuals against the state. Europe, and indeed Norway, was built by establishing the rights of the state to face down greedy individuals. Right? There's a collective interest. Human rights are a collective phenomenon, not just an individual phenomenon. But in Kampala, it's become seriously unbalanced. So the World Bank has insisted on full market capitalization for road widening, and what that's meant in practice in the courts is that every bouncer, every wise guy in Kampala, as soon as a road widening is announced, they squat or they acquire or they do something to get the land that is going to be needed by the state. And then they go to the courts and the judges say, oh, what's the market price? Well, because the widening's been announced, the market price has, of course, gone up a lot. Right? So it's the widening of the road from Kampala to Entebbe is at the moment proving to be, per kilometer, the most expensive road in the world. Right? Well done, right? NGOs. Right? Or we could take electricity. You saw Norfund, thank goodness, is putting money into hydroelectric dams. Right? Ethiopia, where I've been working, the NGOs have been passionately fighting that. In Laos, another desperately poor country, an American NGO has successfully blocked hydropower. Right? No electricity no modern firms, right? Firms need non-human sources of energy, right? That was the miracle that started in about 1750, right? And Africa needs it. So, I'm out of time, but the process of transformation it requires 3 hurdles to be breached. One is a political hurdle, one is a hurdle of changing social norms, and one is this hurdle that I've been talking about of firms. Face reality. Changing politics, changing social norms are pretty well exclusively domestic struggles. Foreigners, such as us, really don't have much part in it, legitimate part. We've massively interfered in local politics, in local norms. I just got an email yesterday from a German, I work a lot with Germany, telling me that, Africa's problem is its fertility. They all have too many children. As if a German has any right to advise any other society on its demographic policies. Germany has the most absurd demographic policies in Europe. Look at it, right? But of course, I've no right to tell the Germans that. And working with the German government, I don't tell it that. And it wouldn't be very welcome, right? I doubt whether the Ugandan trade minister is here to lecture you either on your domestic politics or on your social norms, which doubtless some Ugandans will find pretty offensive, right? She doesn't trespass quite properly, nor should you, right? So, to conclude, I've got 3 messages. One is to business. You're needed. Please come to Africa. There are a lot of opportunities. Right? You're really needed, and you'll be made really welcome. Secondly, to NGOs, get real. Get real or get out. And finally, to politicians, take courage. You need radical change in the financing of, in the use of public finance for development. Norway has started that process of change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, PaulCollier, for very interesting reflections and for very good advices. We know that you have had this engagement for Uganda for several years, and we even have a picture here from your last meeting, I think. It was with the director of the National Authority, Road Authorities.
Louis Kaskende.
Yeah, exactly. One quick question. You have mentioned earlier that there is no quick wins for any country to skip poverty or to get rid of poverty. But you say that every state needs some small successes to build on. Through all your research, do you have an example of such a positive success that you've seen in some countries?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you. I just did an article in the Sunday Times a couple of days ago, saying more or less what I said to you, and then I got a big email post back about it, all positive, I have to say, right? But the first one I read was from a guy in Uganda, because what I'd said in the article was, look, young people, it's great you go to Africa, but try and do something that's productive instead of just poverty tourism. I gave the example of my own son, who spent this summer in Rwanda. He's an aspiring architect. And so he worked with as an apprentice in an African firm of architects, trying to supervise the construction of an office block by an astoundingly incompetent Chinese constructor. So I used that as an example. And this email from Uganda said, yes, absolutely right, I did it. I was a second-generation Ugandan Asian who'd been brought up in Britain. And I had a brilliant education in Britain, you know, sort of Winchester, Oxford, all the rest of it. And then I went into the city in London and, you know, started making money. And then I thought, damn it, let me go and see my home, my parents' home, Uganda. And I went, and that's where I'm now living. I'm running the same sort of business. It's a venture capital business, but I'm doing it in Uganda, and it's thriving. So, you know.
Great, thank you very much. We have the pleasure of hearing more from PaulCollier after the break. But for now, thank you very much.
Thank you.